I've many questions concerning our government's handling of the coronavirus. But this morning I read, according to statistics from Johns Hopkins University, Sweden has 28 deaths per 100,000 inhabitants. Norway has 4 deaths per 100,000 inhabitants. Denmark has 8.7. Finland has 4.5. Even the USA has less than the UK at 21.7. So they're all lower than the UK, which has a nationwide lockdown, and the toll is significantly higher at 44.4 per 100,000 inhabitants. My question is, why and how did the government let this happen when we had advance warning of the figures coming out of other countries? As a country, we're meant to be celebrating VE Day tomorrow, but who feels like celebrating? I don't feel particularly proud of being British when I see figures like that.
Chris, let's start with you.
Well, the death rate is clearly very concerning, and we can talk about numbers, but behind each individual number there is a personal tragedy for both the individual concerned but also their relatives and families.
But what do you think when you hear Margaret list those numbers like that?
Well, it's very concerning. If you look at the levels of mortality that we have in this country, I do think, though, when I talk to my public health colleagues, what they say to me is just be very careful about making international comparisons at this point, because there are a number of different reasons as to why different countries may have different death rates. For example, there isn't a single universal way of recording coronavirus and non-coronavirus.
I get that, and obviously
yeah.
That's something the government have been very keen to say, but nonetheless, whether we're the worst in Europe, we've got the highest death toll in Europe or the second highest death toll in Europe, maybe even the third, it's not where anyone would want to be. And Margaret's question is, why has this happened? What's your view, given you're at the coalface with the ambulance workers and the hospital workers?
I'm quite rightly, Margaret wants an answer to that question, given the levels of deaths that we've had. I mean, the reality is we are going to have to wait to do the real detailed analysis to find out what has happened here. And I think, as I said, it's dangerous, and that's certainly what our public health expert colleagues say, to draw conclusions at this point. Okay. But clearly, with 30,000 deaths, it is a real issue.
I think there are some conclusions we can draw. I'm not party to the intelligence and information that the government has, but I remember in February, 2 local schools where I live in South London were closed because of a coronavirus outbreak and concerns the infection spreading. By then, other countries were already implementing lockdown measures. And it was weeks before our government started to take this seriously. And I think that Margaret's question, which is a really sad one and an honest one to hear, has kind of 2 components. One, why has the government handled it this way? Why has everything taken so long? Why do we always feel like we're playing catch up on PPE, on lockdown measures? And then the second component is the government's tone. Because for me, to hear our government congratulating itself on the way it's handled this outbreak.
So Boris Johnson called it our apparent success.
It's insulting to the people who continue to die every day. And what I would like to see is some honesty from the government, acknowledging that this was not well handled, that mistakes have been made, and telling us clearly and transparently what they intend to do differently. Because at the moment, the gulf between what we're experiencing, the number of people who are dying, the heartbreaking scenarios of people dying alone, often in unnecessary circumstances because we haven't got a grip on this. And the government's rhetoric is only losing further trust. And I think that trust is important right now. And until the government shows some honesty and integrity, we can't even begin to see how we can move forward.
And Jürgen, I saw you were nodding at that.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think Margaret's question is absolutely spot on. And what you said in your question, Margaret, is that we didn't plan ahead. So we're managing this in the here and now. And that makes managing a crisis like this unbelievably difficult. And I think, you know, we should say a huge thank you to all of the people who are doing that. But what should have happened is we should have spent much more time planning early on. And we saw the signs from Italy, and we knew that we had to put testing capacity in place, and we didn't do that early enough, and we didn't lock down fast enough. You know, there should have been a hard, fast lockdown. And in hindsight, we know that would have been better, but we just didn't plan well enough ahead, I'm afraid.
I mean, it's interesting because in February, the UK was ranked second best place to deal with the pandemic. This is by the Global Health Security Index. Margaret saying, how has the government let it happen where we've got a death toll as we have? Nick?
Well, it clearly isn't a reason for celebration, Fiona. It's an extraordinary tragedy for our country and a tragedy for each and every family. And to see that figure today of over 30,600 deaths was startling and shocking.
So what did you think when the Prime Minister described it as talked about our response to the pandemic as our apparent success?
Well, it's not a success or an apparent success, Fiona. And throughout this crisis, we've quite rightly supported the government in its aim of minimising loss of life. But we've also called out things when we thought the government wasn't acting in quite the way that it should. And there are questions about how well prepared the country was for this particular type of pandemic. But we were also slow into lockdown, slow in terms of a comprehensive testing and tracing strategy. And there have been significant problems between what the government has said is available in terms of personal protective equipment and what's actually got to the front line.
And
now,
you say, Nick, you say that the government was too... Sorry, Nick, cutting across you. You say the government was too slow in introducing the lockdown. Was Labour calling for the lockdown to be introduced earlier?
Yes, absolutely, Fiona. And I was there, actually, in the House of Commons on the 23rd of March, and we actually called for the lockdown in the House of Commons prior to it being announced later that day. And I think that was something we raised on the floor of the House that day.
But what about earlier than that? Because that was obviously just a few hours earlier. If you're saying the government was too late in introducing a lockdown, I presume you don't mean by a few hours. I don't really recall that, but maybe I missed it, Labour calling for a lockdown in February, say, for example.
No, listen, what we tried to do throughout this crisis is to be supportive, Fiona. You asked me about when we called for a lockdown. I was sat in the House of Commons on the day that we did. But the point that I'm making really is that, of course, we will come to a point in the future when we must look very robustly with great scrutiny as to what the government did and what differently it could have done throughout this crisis. We have to answer that question as to why we've ended up with this tragic death toll as we have. But at the same time, we can't simply say this is something for the future. I hope the government is learning lessons as it is going along on the issues of testing and tracing, on the issues of personal protective equipment, to try to minimise loss of life going forward.
George? Apparent success? Is that how you describe it?
Well, look, what the Prime Minister was describing there is what we've all done as a country. People who've stayed at home, observed social distancing, our fabulous NHS, and everybody else who's responded to this crisis.
That's that is all to save lives, and we now have this.
Yes, but I think, look, we are in an extraordinary
now.
time, and it is right to acknowledge the steps that everyone has taken, and that's all the Prime Minister was doing. Look, I think the point I'd say here is it's very difficult to make these international comparisons because different countries are recording deaths in different ways. Different countries have different circumstances. London is a huge city with a big public transport system. That could have had an impact early on. There will be a time and a place to reflect and learn lessons from this at the end of this. But for now, we are dealing with this epidemic.
What's interesting about that is I've watched every one of, as you would expect in this job, every one of the press conferences at 5 o'clock since this started. And at the beginning, in the first month or so, when you were showing those international comparisons, there was no reference to the fact that those comparisons might be a bit dodgy when we were below the other European countries. Now that we're above them, the government's very keen to point out that actually we shouldn't be making those comparisons, but you never said that earlier.
Well, we weren't making comparisons. We've always tracked the death rates that have been reported in all countries.
But you didn't warn us off them,
well,
as you are very much trying to do now.
We followed the advice of the Chief Medical Officer and our Chief Scientific Advisor. And the belief all along, which I think was correct, is that we were roughly 2 to 3 weeks behind countries like Italy and France. We were on a different trajectory. That's why it wasn't appropriate to lock down at the point that they did. But it's not true that we weren't prepared. There were all sorts of COBRA meetings and planning meetings that were taking place on this right from January onwards. And it was occupying all of Matt Hancock's time. So lots and lots of planning and preparation went into responding to this. But it was the case that the scientific advice was not that we should have locked down earlier than we did. And as soon as the advice was that we should lock down, it's exactly what we did.
So you think you... sorry.
This is what I mean by honesty. The government has been changing its narrative to fit its results. So initially we liked international comparisons because they made us look good. Now they make us look bad, we can't trust them. The advice on PPE was to use the PPE recommended by the World Health Organization. Until it emerged we didn't have it, and then the PPE advice was changed to fit what we have. The definition of testing was changed when it emerged we couldn't meet the 100,000 tests a day standard we promised until we suddenly could by changing what counts as a test having been sent out rather than a result having been received. And for those of us who aren't medical experts, who are just members of the public watching people we know and love die, there is an unavoidable feeling that the government is not being honest with us about the scale of this crisis. Yes, we've all done everything we can to try and mitigate this, and we are all trying to come together and help. That doesn't make this a success. This makes us people who are suffering and doing our absolute best in circumstances where we can't help but feel that the leadership has failed us. And I think we deserve an honest acknowledgement of that.
Well, it's simply not true that there's been dishonesty or anything in this. From the very beginning, we've been holding daily press conferences. The chief medical officer has been attending many of those, and they've been very, very candid about the nature of this crisis, the reasons we're doing the things that we're doing, very candid about the evidence and the epidemiology behind this. So we've been, I think, as frank as possible with the public, and we've shared with them all of our thinking at every stage.
When the Health Secretary said...
I think the bit that does need to be recognised here is if you wind back to 10, 12 weeks, and we were looking at what had happened in northern Italy, where their health system had been completely overwhelmed, and we had the awful prospect of people turning up to hospitals and simply not being able to be treated. And I think the bit that we do need to recognise is that the NHS has actually created 33,000 beds to treat coronavirus patients. We've created 7 Nightingale hospitals, literally within the space of a fortnight.
It's not worked quite so well with the care sector, though, has it?
No, absolutely. We recognise, I think everybody in the health and care system would recognise it's not worked so well with care homes. But all I'm saying is, if you look at that prospect, the NHS was really clearly told you have to do everything to avoid that overwhelm. And I think the bit that we do need to recognise, because it's due to the hard effort of 1 million frontline staff, is that we have managed to avoid that overwhelm. And as I said, it's very difficult in a sense to kind of talk about celebration when we're talking about this in the context of Margaret's question of 30,000 deaths. But we should recognise that.
But why do you think... I mean, George is saying we did everything at the right time. Lockdown was done at the right time. Why do you think, then, if that is true, not according to you, Afua, why do you think we have so many deaths, then?
Well, I think it's really difficult to tell at this point, Fiona. And as I said, I know that people quite rightly want the answers, but there are potentially lots of reasons. If you look at population density is clearly one. I think you raised quite correctly the fact that our social care sector has been completely neglected, and we know that what happens in a crisis is that the crisis inevitably finds the weakest link in terms of the area that's been underinvested in, that hasn't been sorted out. So there are some reasons, I'm sure, but all I'm saying is we need to be careful about jumping to immediate conclusions on the basis of, to be frank, incomplete evidence at this point.
Nick...
although I think...
sorry, Jürgen, yes.
Fiona, I mean, all this discussion about comparisons and we're not sure. I mean, I think the data is good enough for us to say that a country like ours, like Britain, with all of its capability, we should have done better. We should be doing better. There's no doubt about that in my mind. And I think in terms of the planning, I'd like to come back to this point of testing. We didn't plan ahead well enough. If we would have done, we would have had the tests of the 100,000 in place by the beginning of April, not started building it at the beginning of April. So I think there were some key lessons, and I do think we've got a long way to go. We need to live and manage this situation, and I do agree with Afua's point that a bit of honesty, a bit of learning, so that we can learn as we go into the next phase and really make sure that we make a better job as we now try and exit out of this terrible situation.
And Nick, you had your hand up. You want to come in. I mean, George is saying that government has been candid throughout. Do you feel that?
Well, the government has been inconsistent, not least around the issue of testing and tracing. The lockdown was absolutely essential, but it was a blunt instrument unless you had a testing and tracing strategy. Now, the government was actually doing community testing, but it stopped doing that on the 12th of March. Originally, it was said that was a policy decision, but more lately, it seems it's been admitted that was because of a lack of capacity. Now, it took weeks and weeks after that for the government to then start to actually ramp up testing to the level that it needed to be at. But it's not got to that yet, and I'm afraid that hitting the target on the 30th of April, it seems that that was done by putting a number of tests in the post without an actual guarantee that those tests had been used. And we've seen the test numbers, again, falling below 100,000 in recent days. Now, that needs to be ramped up again very significantly, and it needs to be attached to a proper tracing strategy. And that really has to be a focus now for the government in the weeks ahead.
Let me come back to Margaret. So, Margaret, you've sat here very patiently and listened to that, and thank you for that. You said figures like the ones you quoted don't make you feel proud to be British. What do you feel about the responses you've heard?
Oh, just disappointed. They haven't really answered anything. And I agree with some of the points. We've got to wait and see. However...
So what would your question... We've got George Eustace here from the government. What would your question be directly to him?
Why didn't they have testing, PPE earlier? What the government must have known about it.
Well, we have ramped up testing considerably. So
that's not the question. The question is, why didn't you have it earlier?
Well, there are some countries that had more diagnostic labs. So countries like Germany had a lot of those diagnostic labs. We had to expand them from scratch. And the Army have been involved in this and done a fantastic job. We've now got 90 mobile testing units around the country, 50 drive-through centres.
Could you have ramped it up earlier? I mean, there's been an enormous effort.
They ramped it up as quickly as they could. And we're now at that 100,000 capacity, and it's going to double again over the next month. We will be ramping it up further.
Margaret, does that satisfy you?
No.
No.
I should say as well...
I'm full of praise for the NHS. I'm not criticising the NHS. I think they've done a wonderful job. I'm criticising the government's lack of preparedness.